Good morning, brothers and sisters. Yesterday we had a sermon based on Daniel 4:17, which in part reads, "The Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." And we learned from this passage and several others like it that we don't need to be fearful about the upcoming election because the Lord God Most High is in charge, and basically he will be the one to sovereignly elect the next president. But of course, that brings with it a whole lot of questions that we'll try to answer throughout this week in the devotional times. And the first question for today that I want to address is then, in light of God's sovereignty, should we vote? Because at one point during yesterday's message, I said something like, if we think our vote is going to change the will of God, then we are seriously mistaken. So if that is the case, then isn't voting useless? Should we do it? Why should we bother if God is just going to do what he wants to do anyway? But this actually leads us to a slightly deeper question to ask first. Assuming we do vote, why do we vote? What is the motivation for voting in the first place? Well, let's break it down a little bit, and we need to start off at the very, very basic level. Because if voting is part of the picture in terms of forms of government, then we're talking about some version of a democracy, whether a true democracy or a representative democracy like we have in America. And in either case, it is important to realize that a foundational and integral part of the government itself is the citizenry. The democracy of this nation, at least in theory, is built on we the people. And therefore the citizens are not only the ones governed, but they also wield governmental authority. To put it simply, at an essential level, the citizens are part of the government. And if we go back to Romans 13, we see things start to swim into focus. Because not only does God call us to submit to the authority of government in Romans 13, verse 1, but we are also part of the government that Paul says God has instituted to act as his servant to do good to those who do right and to judge those who do wrong. That's found in verses 3 and 4. So, let me quickly clarify, though, that this doing good and bringing judgment is all within the legitimate role of governmental authority. This is not an excuse to make yourself a vigilante, dispensing justice and bringing God's wrath down on whom you personally believe deserve it. Romans 13:14 does not let us all be our own personal Batman. No, this authority to bless and judge is firmly fixed in our role as a legitimate part of the governmental process as the citizens of a representative democracy, which will most commonly be expressed through voting. In any case, if we see ourselves correctly, and we are, as fulfilling a foundational role in the government of this nation, then that would lead me to say, yes, we vote. But then we immediately understand the motivation for voting, which is, since we are part of the governmental authority that God has established, that we fulfill our role as God's servants in this way. And if God uses some governmental authorities, like Nebuchadnezzar from yesterday's sermon, and uses them to fulfill his purposes even when they don't realize that's what's happening, how much more eager should we be to serve his purposes knowingly? And we have the outline, at least generally speaking, of his purposes for all governments everywhere right here in Romans 13, which is to do good to those that are in the right and to bring God's wrath upon the wrongdoer. In other words, the basic purpose of any given government is to be just and to rule justly. And therefore, our role as citizens in a democracy is to vote for those candidates and those laws that promote God's justice, that do good for the righteous, and that will bring judgment on the wrongdoer. Of course, keeping in mind God's standards of righteousness and wrongdoing when it comes to this. And so I think we have a very solid argument that Christians ought to vote, but we must never lose sight of the reason why we vote. We do not vote in an attempt to force our own agenda. We do not vote thinking that we are going to save the world politically or return this nation to its glory days. And we do not vote as a way to put our trust in the one we're voting for. No, we vote because it is a legitimate government function. It is a fundamental way in which we as citizens have been called on to wield that governmental authority. And Romans 13 tells us that God establishes every governmental authority that exists, which we now understand includes you and me in our capacity as voters. Therefore, we must submit to the sovereign Lord as his servants in that governmental authority. And we have the basic outline right here in Romans 13 for how to do that. Again, we vote for that which will bring our nation closer to righteousness and justice according to God's standards. But then we bow to the sovereign will of the Lord, because even though He has given us that general outline, He also has the prerogative to do something different in any given case. And so we might say, if the person that we think is ungodly, or the most ungodly, actually gets elected, we say, well, what gives? I voted for the one that I thought would give righteousness and such. Isn't that God's will? Well, generally, yes. But we must always be willing to submit ourselves to God's sovereign purpose and acknowledge that we cannot see all things as God can. We do not have perfect understanding nor a perfect plan as God does. And He might be saying, I am putting this wicked person in leadership as an act of judgment. Or He might be saying, I am putting this wicked person in leadership and I'm going to use him to bless, even though that's the last thing on His mind. Friends, we vote for the proper reason, in obedience and submission to God as His servants, in all cases as His servants who are also His children, His loved ones, His people, but then in this case, also as His servants because we are part of the governmental authority that He Himself has put into place. And if we are willing to be obedient to Him in that way, then when He does something we don't expect, we can submit all the more in the knowledge that our God alone is good, our God alone is holy, our God alone is righteous, and His plan is perfect. And so we submit to His sovereignty. Have a good and godly day, and submit to the Lord as you vote.